Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here today, talking about my absolute favorite subject in business, and that is happiness, which sometimes seems a little bit odd. But we're going to introduce you today, and we can't teach you everything, but to introduce you to some of the science of building happier, higher performing teams. And we're going to take a real good look at both individuals, but also how we can scale happiness outside of individuals to spread across organizations. So as was mentioned, my name is Jim Moss. I'm a Chief Executive Officer. I also go by Chief Happiness Officer. And you can tweet at us today outside of the webinar at the Smile CEO or at Plasticity. So Plasticity Labs is the company that my wife and I and Lance Mooring founded. And as was mentioned, we're on a mission to help 1 billion people to have access to the tools to live a happier life. You can also feel free to email me directly at jim@plasticitylabs.com, and that can be anytime today or in the future. Just very quickly, some of the things that we hope you'll be able to take away for today from our presentations. We're going to start with, is employee happiness actually important? And answering that question. What does it mean? What is the definition of happiness? And you should be able to very confidently take that away at the end of the day. And then we're going to help you to understand how to make the case to senior management. So there's probably very many of you out there who already believe that this is the right thing to do, maybe don't know how to do it quite yet, but you need to get senior leadership buy-in to help to be able to make this effort. We'll help you make that case. We'll show you a few very simple ways that you could get started as soon as today, and then we'll outline some business cases to actually show you some of the things that by focusing on employee happiness, how that actually impacts businesses in a really positive way. Again, to help you make that case to your senior leadership. And then at the end, we're going to leave you with some great people to connect with. So people that are inside of our network, but also focused on happiness on a much larger global scale. Great people to follow on Twitter and on LinkedIn and to look for their videos online. So workplace happiness. If you had have asked this question or brought up this subject 50 years ago, you might get laughed out of the typical boardroom. Is that too bold? Is it too bold to talk about workplace happiness? Well, we did a survey of 487 employees when we got started on this effort, and it really didn't seem to be too bold according to employees. So we polled 487 working Canadians, and here's some of the overwhelming statistics that we found. 95% of those people believe that they have an actual right to be happy. 94% believe that happiness can be improved, and this is a really important one. We're going to return to this one again in the future. 92% believe that companies should actually be investing in the happiness of employees. But what's really promising here as well is that 85% of people were actually interested in learning the skills to be happier at work. And what that means is that not only do they believe that it can be improved, not only do they believe that skills can be learned to improve your happiness, but they're willing to do the work. So they're not expecting companies to do all of the heavy lifting. Let's just return to this statistic real quick. 92% of employees that we polled believe that companies should be investing in the happiness of their employees. That means if you're a SME company of 100 employees, 92 of those employees believe you should be investing. If you've got 1,000 employees, 920 of those 1,000 employees believe that you should be investing in their happiness. But again, just a reminder that they're not asking you to do all the work. They're asking you to actually start to facilitate their happiness in the workplace, and that they're really willing to get involved and do some of that work with you. So when we talk about happiness, we're going to use the definition that's put forward by Sean Aker. So Sean Aker is a Harvard researcher, and now he now runs a company called Good Think. He's one of the most famous public speakers in the world on this topic, and he's a leading expert on happiness and performance. Sean recently joined our board of directors, and he was highlighted on Oprah Winfrey over the course of the last year. He was actually one of her top speakers on her list at the end of the year last year. Sean puts forward the definition of happiness like this: the joy that we feel while striving for our potential. And this is a really great, succinct definition. And if we look at it a little more closely, we can kind of tease it apart into the ingredients. So when we talk about the joy that we feel, that really highlights that it's personal and it's experiential. So it is up to the individual to decide what it is that brings them happiness, and that we can't impose that externally because it's a feeling that they either have or they don't have. The other really important part here is that this definition speaks to a growth mindset. So the joy that we feel while striving for our potential. So humans love to grow, they love to develop. And so the experience, the moment-to-moment experience of joy on the path to reaching our potential is how Sean likes to put forward his definition. So now if we bring that into the context of workplace or organizational happiness, we can substitute the individuals with the organization. So what we would like to suggest is that organizational happiness is the joy that we collectively experience while striving to reach our collective potential. So one of the dangers when you bring up the word happiness in a boardroom is that it can sometimes be interpreted as fluffy or as, not necessarily as important as other topics. But I would challenge any CEO to interpret this definition as fluffy. Every CEO in the world who is really taking their organization in the most positive direction would agree that experiencing joy collectively while we try to reach our organizational potential would be a really positive thing. It doesn't sound so ridiculous after all when we talk about it like that. So where did this happiness science come from? Well, it rooted very deeply in classical psychology, but there was a tipping point about 20 years ago put forward by Dr. Martin Seligman. At the time, he was the American Psychology Association president, and he stood up and made a keynote that was monumental. And he said, we shouldn't be focusing on getting people who are unwell back to an average state of wellness, but we should really start to focus on helping people to flourish. And so he's put forth this model of 5 things, 5 different aspects of human life that are most likely going to improve or become improved when people start to experience high levels of happiness. If we look at them, they are positive emotions. So how many times throughout the day or throughout a week or time period do we experience positive emotions? How engaged are we with life? So looking at it outside of the workplace context, do we lay on the couch all day, or do we put ourselves out into the world to have experiences, and do we engage with our surroundings? How many and how high of quality do we have in terms of positive relationships? So relationships that we're putting into in a positive way, but also relationships where we can gain from them in a positive way. Do we understand what brings us meaning, and do we seek out meaning in life? And this can be very, very personal. Again, for some people, parenting is one of the most meaningful things that they'll ever do in their life. And for others, it's getting their PhD or having organizational or individual accomplishments. And that brings us to the last one, A, accomplishment. Humans really do gain a lot of joy from growing and having accomplishments. And we'd like to highlight that this isn't major accomplishments, or it's certainly not limited to major accomplishments. It can be very much the day-to-day accomplishments, the ones that add up to the major accomplishments over time. So all 5 of these things really directly correlate and translate into the workplace very well, because we would love to have more positive emotions experienced in the workplace, higher levels of engagement, people engaging with their work, engaging with culture, people building and maintaining positive relationships, whether that's between employees or across the line with relationships with customers, that they're able to derive meaning out of the work that they do, and obviously that they're able to have workplace accomplishments or career accomplishments. So talk a little bit about unhappiness for a second, because what is it not? And what happiness isn't, I'd like to highlight, is it's not avoiding negative events. It's not putting your hand or your head in the sand. It's very much about being better able to handle challenges. And when we talk about unhappiness, unhappiness comes when we have the absence of these other things, and it shows up in really interesting ways. And we'll talk about the neuroscience in a minute, but the way that it shows up in organizations is that individuals, when they're in an unhappy or fearful state, experienced reduced access to their prefrontal cortex. So that is where the best and most important decisions are made. So the ability to make more and better decisions. They have reduced access to the creative centers of the brain, and that speaks to things like problem solving, and innovation. For some people, creativity is actually the core of their work, and so they can have reduced access to the core skill that they require. It increases our emotional reactivity, which means that we're more likely to get emotional reactions that are larger and overblown and potentially less positive or distracting. And then we'll experience more and more of those when people are in a state of unhappiness, which makes perfect sense. And then reduced ability to focus. So not only the ability to focus deeply, but the ability to focus for a longer duration of time. So it's very easy to see that unhappiness can create real difficulties for individuals in organizations. So just briefly touch on a little bit of the deeper science, mostly because it's really cool and it makes a lot of sense, makes it add up. If we boil it down to kind of the most simple way to tell the story, there's this little brain region, and it's in the base of your brain. It's called the amygdala. It's part of our lower brain or our earlier evolutionary brain. And its primary function, from what we can tell with science over the last 20 to 30 years, is that it moderates our emotional state. And predominantly it's focused on, am I safe, or do I have something that I need to fear? Am I worried about something? And when we say fear, we're not talking about, am I going to get eaten by a saber-toothed lion, or did I just dodge a car accident? It can be very minor things. It can be, does somebody speak really loudly in the office and distract me from my work? Does somebody sneak up behind me and startle me? Do I fear going into this meeting? Or is somebody going to get back up on their soapbox in this meeting and distract us from the ability to have a productive time together? These things can be interpreted by the brain as fearful. And what happens is the amygdala sets off a chain reaction of neurotransmitters that effectively reduce our cognitive abilities by as much as 30%. So to make it very simple, it basically pulls bandwidth offline to prepare for the requirement to potentially have to fight or flee. And we don't do that necessarily in the workplace, but that is kind of an evolutionary hangover, where we used to have to worry about that more in the natural world, but not so much in today's world. So if we bring that, and we kind of bring that context into an organization, imagine a 30% reduction in the resources that you require to get work done. If we look at your workforce, for example, imagine losing 30% of your workforce on any given day. If you take away 30% of the resources that you have to get the job done, you would be severely handicapped in your ability to perform at the highest level. And that's exactly what's happening with individuals. When they're in a state of fear, or they're experiencing unhappiness, depression, anxiety, all of these things, it leads to as much of a 30% reduction in resources on average. And we know that that has an incredible impact. So let's imagine for a minute that you're bought into this whole concept of happiness, whether it's individually or it's for a department or organization. It's not necessarily easy to know exactly where to start. And we know that when we've got really new challenges to face, that we don't necessarily typically just get started doing it. But sometimes it can be much more simple. It can be easier than we like to think, but we're not sure, so we don't know where to start. So I'd like to give you this example. This is a company called Ruby Receptionists. They're in the Pacific Northwest in the United States. They essentially offer outsourced reception services. So your company phone rings in their offices, and you've got a person who is representing your organization, but who doesn't work for you. They're just providing this service. So you can imagine it's very, very customer service focused, because they're dealing with your customers, but you're also a customer of theirs. And so they had incredible leadership buy-in all the way to the top. Their CEO really believes firmly that the happiness of their individuals will impact their ability to provide the service that they provide. So their CEO adopted this very, very simple gratitude journal activity. They actually created analog or paper-based gratitude journals and distributed them out to the employees of Ruby Receptionists. And each day, employees were asked to focus on things that they were grateful for. And then they had a couple of other simple little questions like, have you done anything to increase your physical activity today? And over the course of 21 days, using no technology whatsoever, but because they had leadership buy-in, they were able to accomplish a 60% improvement on task accuracy. That's 60% fewer mistakes. When you're in a customer service business, mistakes create two things: more work and unhappy customers. So 60% improvement on task accuracy is a huge deal, and they were able to get that by spending a few minutes every day for 21 days focusing on what they're grateful for. And not even necessarily what they were grateful for at work. It could be what they were grateful for on any part of their life. Oftentimes I'm grateful for the hot coffee that I've got on my desk because it's a great way to start my day when I start to dig into emails. It can be very, very simple things, but it primes our brain to be in a much more positive state, and most importantly, it keeps all of our best resources online and available to use. So what's interesting about this case study is that they had data. So even though it was an analog intervention, they understood which metric they were trying to improve, and they had data to track the improvement of that metric. In their case, it was the competency on simple tasks that make up their interactions. Without data, it's very difficult to make the case to senior leadership. Most leaders, they draw on financial data, they draw on performance data, they draw on organizational outcomes, and that's how they make the best decisions, is by tracking KPIs, understanding how those KPIs change. So if we try to bring forward things like measuring and improving employee happiness without data, we have a very difficult time making that case successfully to get the type of leadership buy-in that we need to be able to measure and improve employee happiness. So, some leaders are going to buy into this idea a whole lot easier than others. And oftentimes, we've got a CEO, for example, who buys in, but you really have to make the case to the CEO, to the CFO. And that's because they need to understand what is the ROI of investing in this way. How is investing in employee happiness going to improve our organizational performance? Many times they have shareholders that they actually have to make that exact case to. So here's our simple suggestions to start making a better case immediately to challenge your leaders. Bring them data. With that data, you can start to help them understand what is the cost of not doing anything. What is the cost of not understanding employee happiness? What is the cost of not investing or improving employee happiness? And once you're able to do that, you can really start to highlight the opportunities. And these opportunities don't need to be expensive. You can see in the Ruby receptionist example, it was literally, the cost was a few minutes of employees' time every day and printing up a few of these analog gratitude journals where people spent some time reporting what they were grateful for. But you can highlight those opportunities, plus you can make the case that when we do try to make these interventions, we're able to track how did it go, how did it make the needle move, and also how could we do it better again the next time. Because it's very rare that we do anything once. And so data helps us to understand how to iterate positively to make headway for the future. So there's a couple different kinds of data, and we like to start with bad data. There's bad data, there's good data, there's better data, and then there's the best data. So let's take a look at what that kind of data looks like, historically, and now based on technology, how we can improve our efforts to get the best data, to be able to make the best business case, but also really be able to provide meaning to employees. And then we'll go through some case studies to be able to help you understand how that looks. So here's an example of bad data. So it is data, no doubt about it, but for years we've all been doing the annual surveys, and we look at things like engagement. Oftentimes we look at 60 or 70 questions, and typically when we bring up the annual survey in a boardroom, we get a very similar response, which is kind of an eye roll, and people sit back in their seat, and you kind of get this exhale of, ugh. Nobody really looks forward to it, but 20 years ago, that was the best that we had, the best ability that we had to really capture employee data and sentiment. So here's an example of a company who measured employee data a single time across the year, and it really doesn't tell you anything useful or meaningful. It's just a snapshot in time, but it doesn't help you understand how is it changing, where did it come from, what direction is it heading in, what is the trend. And because of that, you're not able to make better decisions. So here's an example of slightly better data. So we call this good data. Good data, there's more of it, first of all, and it starts to show you how things are changing over time. So where are we coming from? Where are we going? What are the trends? And what's potentially causing the changes that we can see by tracking the data over time? So in this example, we're looking at the happiness or the employee happiness of individuals in the sales department. You can see here, and remember, this isn't sales. This is the happiness of employees in the sales department or on the sales team. So you can see happiness tracking really positively in the first quarter, and then there's an event that is potentially in the control of the organization, but the VP of sales resigns. That causes uncertainty and changes the happiness level of the sales employees. 60 to 75 days later, a new VP of sales is hired. You can see, though, that the data doesn't turn things around immediately. People need to see it get traction and feel like things are getting back on track. And so by continually measuring, by having more data, you can understand when you're starting to get back on track and when are you starting to hit the levels that you were at before that event happened. Now let's look at slightly better data. So here's an example where we can now measure one department against another. And these two departments, sales and customer service, are very intimately intertwined. You know, sales leads to customer service. Customer service often leads to sales. So even though these departments are often separated, their data is often quite intertwined. But by having better data, so data across multiple departments or locations or groups, and being able to compare it, now we can not only understand how one group or the other is ebbing and flowing across time, but we can see how they are interacting and how those interactions are impacting the individual happiness. The green line there is an actual moving average. So then you can also compare that to how are we versus how we've been over the last 3 months. Is one department above average, below average? And you can see that even after 12 months, we start to get just a little bit of a predictability with that green arrow on the right side of the screen. So in this case, we can see that as happiness is declining in the sales department, and in this case it's because sales are actually declining because we're in the absence of a VP of HR, customer service happiness actually improves and goes above the level of happiness of the sales organization. That's because there's less work to do and they're feeling a little bit less overworked. It makes perfect sense. And then if we look, as the sales team starts to ramp back up and they're driving sales again, customer acquisition is growing, but customer service is starting to feel taxed again because they've got to keep up again with this new pace of inbound customers that are coming into the organization. And then if we look forward about 90 days in the future, we can see that it starts to normalize again. And so this event took about 9 to 10 months. And you can imagine if we only had that single measure in May, none of this information can help us to make better decisions or to understand how our actions are impacting employees. Now let's look at the best kind of data. So the best kind of data is long-term data. So once you start really tracking information like this, you'll find that you never want to stop, because it allows us to not only compare ourselves internally, but to benchmark externally, to identify patterns over time, and that's exactly what we see here. So again, this is sales versus customer service data, but you can see that we've expanded this to be across 24 months, and we're able to start to get real predictions off on the right-hand side. So what we see here is the example where in January and February, in sales-driven organizations, specifically in retail, there is sales go down because Christmas is over, and there's a heavy weight put on customer service for things like returns, things like customer satisfaction. And by being able to understand that that's a cyclical event that happens every year, now you can start to get involved and get engaged with how do we improve employee happiness during those periods of time. By having the data from the past, we can test drive new initiatives the next year, learn what works, and then the next year iterate and improve again, because we understand that there are these cycles to employee happiness. So when we work with customers, we see incredible cycles. Oftentimes we see them, a really important one is back to school time. So, anybody who's got kids knows that your entire flow of life changes on the Tuesday after Labor Day in Canada. And that's because we've got to hustle to make 2 or 3 lunches, get kids dressed, get them out the door, and then we hustle off to work, and there's a lot of stress, and we're worried about getting there late. And then when we show up, we're flustered. There's more people on the roads. So we typically see that data for about 3 weeks in September goes haywire. And oftentimes when it starts to normalize, it doesn't just return to the patterns that it had before. It's actually modulated or changed. So you'll say to me, well, what can we do about back to school season? You know, that's an external event in people's lives. But a lot of this data actually helps us to understand how to make policies to improve outcomes even against external events. So when we start to understand how those policies impact people, now we can do things like suggest that people don't need to be there at 9. They can get there at 9:30. So take some time for the first couple weeks of September. Get back into that flow of getting the kids out the door, figure out what it's like dropping them off at the new school, get to work with a little bit less stress and able to be productive. Even though they're there 30 minutes later, they're much more productive, much faster when they get there. So data helps us create policies that will build happy organizational cultures. So the best data is long-term. It helps you make and test predictions and craft better policies for continued and ongoing future success. So let's look at a couple of case studies where organizations have refocused on individual and organizational happiness. And by doing that, what are some of the things that you expect to happen, but also what are some of the things that you can learn just because you've started to increase or improve the level of focus that you have. Also, just wanted to let you know if you've got questions coming in, that we will be leaving some time at the end to answer the questions. Please keep them coming. And if we don't get a chance to answer your questions, we're actually going to print those questions out. We'll answer them all, and we'll make that available to people to download in the future or to be able to get their questions answered. So let's take a look at Fibernetics. Fibernetics is a Canadian telecom company with about 300 employees. They actually have a bit more than that now, spread out across 4 countries. They've got a call center in the Dominican Republic. They've got offices in Western Canada and Eastern Canada. They've got development efforts over in Europe. And they made an entire about-face on organizational culture. They focused on building happiness into the core of the culture of who they are as an organization. So to do that, they made a very, it wasn't a huge financial investment, but it was a big investment of time and energy and focus. So they rolled out a new mission statement, which was to deliver happiness and connections daily by being awesome. And they actually have this mantra that's called I'm in. And John Sticks, who is the president of the organization, really lives and breathes this every day. They wear t-shirts around the office that say I'm in. And by saying I'm in, you're actually buying into delivering happiness and connections daily by being awesome. So they went through a major rebranding as well and brought happiness into the core of their branding. They started to track happiness daily, and then they rolled out new core values. But not only did they roll out the core values, but they instituted our tool, which gave them the ability to track the adoption of those values and understand what does it look like to be in? What does it sound like in words to be in? And so at the end of the year, we're able to tell them, here are the 3 core values that are really resonating with people. They're really living those out in an authentic way that is very much in line with how you intended those core values. And also, here are some that don't seem to be resonating with employees. So if you're going to spend some time and energy reinforcing some of these core values, these are the ones to focus on. So let's take a look at some of the outcomes of this major refocus, cultural refocus on happiness. The volatility of employee happiness, and because they're measuring it, we can learn that and understand that, it reduced by half. And average happiness of employees in the company increased by 10% in the first 12 months. So a lot of times when we talk about improving happiness, people think that that just means that it's moving up and to the right. So the scores are getting higher. But the human brain really doesn't like volatility either. And so the reduction in volatility, so whether on a 100-point scale Whether you think you're a 60 one day and a 90 the next day and a 30 one day and a 70 the next day, that's high volatility. And volatility is usually predictive of burnout and of real highs and lows. So an improvement in happiness is also just reducing that volatility and having a much smoother ebb and flow of happiness. So we get into the kind of the dollars and cents return on investment that they've been able to see. They've had 4 quarters of the highest percentage sales growth in company history. So by focusing their organization on the happiness of employees and customers, a company that's 12 years old with 300 plus employees sees 4 quarters of the highest percentage sales growth in company history. And we're going to give you John Stick's contact information, his Twitter handle. You can reach out to them. He loves to talk about this, and he'd be happy to answer your questions about how they did this and how they've done it and what success they're seeing. But they've also seen the highest level of customer satisfaction in recorded company history. So this is actually translating not to just to employees, but to customers, to sales growth and to customer satisfaction or net promoter score. And then this one's really incredible as well, because their competition is TELUS, Rogers, Bell, the big telecom companies that are out there. But over the course of the 12 months, they were actually able to increase customer retention to not only the highest level in their company history, but also the highest level in the entire industry. All right, let's take a look at another case study here. So we've kept this company anonymous because they're still going through this in an ongoing way. But they're a tech company of approximately 100 employees. They're headquartered in Ontario, but they have offices in Alberta, Texas, and New Zealand. So they're international and also multi-provincial across Canada. And this is an example of an external event. So this is another example of that. We can't control everything that has an impact on employee happiness. And we don't suggest that you can. But by having information, you can respond and react to those external events. So oftentimes at Plasticity, we talk about by measuring happiness as frequently as daily, it's able to provide an early warning device, an early warning indicator of things that might be happening. So that's exactly what we saw here. So the external event is the economic downturn, specifically in the province of Alberta, and driven by the falling price of oil. So that doesn't necessarily directly impact these employees, but it is a massive external economic event that causes a ton of stress, creates instability. People aren't sure if their jobs are still going to be there. They're facing things like provincial taxes for the first time, all things that we all know would impact our own individual happiness if they were happening where we live. So the signal that we're able to get by tracking employee data over time and taking a scientific approach to employee happiness is that the median happiness of the entire organization began to decline. And when we notice that, then we take a closer look and say, okay, what's driving this reduction in employee happiness? And we're able to find that it is predominantly the employees that are in Alberta, and their happiness is declining rapidly, so becoming very volatile. But not just their happiness, because we do measure other things as well, and we measure what we call the hero traits, which are things like hope and efficacy and resilience and optimism and gratitude and empathy and mindfulness. And you can learn more about that on our website if you want. That's actually a webinar for a different day in itself, the workplace hero traits. But by understanding the impact of this external event, we were able to find that it was actually starting to show a decline in the employee levels of hope, optimism, and gratitude. And that means that not only is it impacting how they feel about work, how they feel about living in the province of Alberta, it was actually starting to impact their sense of self. They were less hopeful, they were less optimistic. And when it makes it as far as gratitude, when people are having a difficult time recalling things that they're grateful for, that's the sign of when it's about to really accelerate. So by understanding this is happening in real time, not waiting until it starts to show up where employees are leaving or where sales start to decline or customer service numbers start to go down, and then you go back and try and forensically understand what's happening. But by knowing that it's happening in real time, we were able to signal this data and communicate this data to senior management of the organization. They booked flights immediately, and they were on the ground in less than 14 days, just showing up and effectively saying, okay, we see that this is happening, and we'd love to talk to you about it and see, is there ways that we can provide you more reassurance that your jobs are safe? Is there ways that we can help you to make financial decisions and support you through this difficult time? They were also able to, understand how the manager in that space was handling this on the ground, and to be able to help them understand this data to know that this is a much bigger problem than we maybe think on the surface. And then what we're able to see is that by going out and proactively getting involved, the negative impact on the employee happiness started to track more positively within 14 days. So that means this problem is identified, it is approached, and then it is starting to be mitigated all in less than 30 days, oftentimes before other organizations who aren't tracking this kind of data in an ongoing way or taking a scientific approach to happiness, before they would even know that something was really going on. That means that they're saving a lot of potential dollars. They're saving these heavy outcomes, the expense of employee happiness, and it's all because they're measuring on a day-to-day basis. So let's take a look, and this is our last case study here, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions in about 5 minutes. But let's take a look at, an inherently unhappy event. In this case, there's a technology company headquartered in Canada. They have offices around the world, and an employee had a tragic sudden death, an employee of 20 years. So somebody who was actually a member of the founding team of the company, was very core to the culture of the organization. Obviously, you're aware that this person has passed on, but the data is able to also find this. And what it said specifically was that not only was the median happiness data of the whole organization being impacted, but it showed that the decline was immediately and demonstrably worse in the department where that employee was from and in the geographic offices. And this all makes perfect sense. But what does this help? How does this help us when you've got the better or best data? How does this help us to make changes? Well, by understanding the depth of the impact and the people who are being impacted the most, who aren't always the most obvious ones. Oftentimes there's somebody in a different office or a customer who's really interfaced with that employee for a long time, and you might not even be aware of the extent of that. But by tracking employee happiness, you can see where this is causing the deepest levels of grief. We were able to modify the platform that we use with them immediately and start capturing stories to memorialize that employee. So focusing on the positives, almost like an ongoing digital wake for that employee where they were celebrating the good stories and telling stories that maybe other employees never even were aware of or knew. And that was able to create more healthy coping as an organization. What we were able to see was that happiness started to return to previous levels within about 4 weeks. So again, really being able to quantify when are we starting to make our way through this very difficult event, and helping managers to understand when is it safe to work with this group in a forward-thinking way again. When is it too early? If you don't have data, you don't know when you could really be off-putting employees because they haven't felt that you've embraced the fact that they're grieving. So they were able to understand not only when it was safe to continue, but they were able to know that they had really started to respect the emotions and the employees and the grieving process through this inherently very difficult event. An interesting sidebar in this one is that they were also able to take those stories and the memorial for that employee, and they had it published, and they provided that book to the family, because oftentimes the family doesn't know all the stories or how much meaning that individual created through their relationships with employees and with customers. So that's the 3 case studies that we're going to go through today, and you may think, well, I'm this kind of company or I'm that kind of company, and it doesn't seem like happiness is something that's appropriate for us to track or to invest in. But just to give you some examples, it's everything from SMEs to large enterprises. We've got entire cities who are doing this now, nonprofits, we've got banks and credit unions and financial institutions, technology companies, technology incubators. We have one of the largest medical device companies in the world who is doing this. We've got universities who are looking at both students but also looking at the employee base of the university. We've got advertising and marketing firms, even have manufacturing companies where it's not as easy, where they don't have technology necessarily that they interface with every day. We're also working with some of the biggest retail chains in the world and the fastest growing and most exciting. So no matter what you do, if you've got employees, employee happiness matters. No matter what size you are, employee happiness matters. Obviously, as we get bigger, we get spread out across larger geographic regions, then we've got a much harder time gaining that emotional intelligence about employees. But technology is here now, and it's here to stay, and it really does facilitate our ability to track and improve employee happiness in meaningful ways. So just real quick, here's a couple of people that we really suggest are worth following if you want to learn more about employee happiness. So Sean Aker, we mentioned him before, he actually has the 6th most watched TED Talk of all time, and it specifically talks about organizational happiness. He's incredible, he's super funny. Michelle Guylan is his wife. They're actually a power couple in the employee happiness space, and they're both public speakers, very dynamic, and they do a ton of research. Tony Guerreri is the chief of WOW at Roma Molding, and Roma Molding is a family-run business that's grown incredibly over the past few years, and they're based in North Toronto. And Tony really believes in employee happiness, and he's investing in it every day and really benefiting from the impact of employee happiness. My wife and our co-founder and chief marketing officer, Jennifer Moss. Jenny's a public speaker as well on this. She's very, very passionate, and she puts out a ton of great content, constantly bringing out the most recent scientific evidence and making it approachable to people. John Sticks, he's the president of Fibernetics, and he's very, very open. He's super passionate about not just culture, but happiness. And Kelly McGonigal is just a super dynamic. If you can watch a few TED Talks, some of Kelly's talks are the best to watch. She even has a talk out there about how video games are actually improving things like hope and optimism in young boys. So she's able to use science, the science of happiness, to really prove some of the things that you might believe out there. Send us an email at info@plasticitylabs.com, and we're happy to help review what you're doing to measure organizational culture currently and help you understand how you might be able to improve organizational happiness in the future.